Hello everybody, my name is Kerbunny, and today we're going to take a look at some promotional renders produced for Rare's trilogy of Donkey Kong Country games. The last video was an overwhelming and highly unexpected success, so I'm more than happy to come back and review another collection of artifacts from the earlier, cozier days of 3D graphics. The original Donkey Kong Country owes its existence to a variety of factors that converged in the early 90s. Nintendo was desperate to release a game that could graphically outperform titles on the Sega Genesis, particularly the Aladdin tie-in game. Rare had just purchased a number of very expensive Silicon Graphics workstations and hoped to explore the wonders of the computerized third dimension. And Donkey Kong was down on his luck after a pair of poorly received titles put his series on indefinite hiatus. With nothing to lose and everything to gain, Nintendo loaned the disgraced gorilla out to Rare and commissioned the development of a platformer for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. The SNES wasn't powerful enough to display 3D models, not real ones anyway, so Donkey Kong Country and its sequels used digitized sprites instead. Whenever we see a character on the screen, we're essentially looking at a series of low-resolution screenshots of a model sculpted and animated on one of Rare's dedicated workstations. These circumstances set the series renders apart from the N64-era Mario renders discussed in the previous video, since those models were completely separate from, and outright better than, the in-game ones. It's kind of funny how the SNES brought us closer to playing games as they appeared in promotional artwork than the N64 ever did. As a result, this video is less about peering into an alternate universe where the characters exist at an uncannily high fidelity, and more about getting a clearer view of the models we've been looking at all along. With that, I think we're ready to dive into the renders. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to tackle the series in chronological order. Let's start with the leader of the bunch. Donkey Kong looks great at a glance. His proportions are balanced and his fur adds some texture that nicely offsets the shinier look of his skin. I'm impressed with his face. It's highly expressive, which lends him a degree of charisma, I guess? It seriously helps to make him seem less like a thick-headed gorilla and more like some dude who wants his stuff back. The tie helps with the everyman perception as well. Speaking of the tie, note how it lacks the iconic DK monogram. I also found a few renders of a separate, worse model of DK. This version looks quite a bit slimmer and is missing a pair of fingers and toes. I have no idea why this thing exists. Maybe it's an earlier model, or maybe it was built for appearances in marketing materials? I think we would have many more shots of it in that case. Besides, the final model appeared in printed materials as well. Take this render of DK challenging the viewer to a staring contest as an example. It appeared on the cover of the official player's guide as well as in this magazine ad. Allow me to draw attention to the tagline. Using the word gruesome to describe an image of DK standing around like a dope makes for a magnificent shitpost. My only real issue with DK's model is how the tufts of fur around his wrists are stiff and raised to the point that they cast shadows on his skin. As someone noted in a comment on the previous video, this effect makes his fur look like sleeves. The implications are numerous and terrifying. Is all of his fur just some weird bodysuit? How much of him is even real? One shudders to imagine what inhuman thoughts lie behind those eyes. Okay, enough jokes. If I had to guess, I would say Rare raised the fur to create a sense of depth and provide enough space to articulate DK's wrists without causing his hands to clip through it. Diddy Kong also suffers from sleeve syndrome, albeit to a lesser extent. His model looks a bit incomplete in hindsight, since it lacks now standard features like the yellow stars on his shirt and nostrils. Diddy also seems to be missing a digit on each of his hands, but this trait actually has a basis in reality. He's a spider monkey, and his real-life counterparts only have 4 fingers. Allow me to reiterate, 4 fingers. I don't know how or why Diddy got a chance to trade his pinkies for opposable thumbs, but he would have been a fool not to take it. The few renders that show DK and Diddy together do a good job of portraying their companionship. I can definitely believe that these two are buddies. I want to draw special attention to this render of them flanking a huge DK logo. One scenario that will become somewhat common as we dig through these renders involves the characters breaking the fourth wall and interacting with real-life objects. These images of DK holding a Nintendo sign and waving a Union Jack serve as additional examples. Sure, they exist to promote the game and define the brand, but they also convey a degree of pride and sincerity. The 3 supporting Kongs who appeared in DKC1 received a handful of renders. Cranky looks sufficiently ancient and crotchety. I don't like his shirt though. It looks stiff and uncomfortable, as if it was made from the same fabric that upholsters those really old, gross couches. Yuck. Thankfully, he wears a much comfier looking sweater nowadays. Funky looks totally radical with his huge gold necklace and even larger grin. His design is charming, and my only complaint is that his sunglasses always expose a weird portion of one eye. I'm struggling to imagine a pair of normal eyes back there, even though I know they exist. Candy looks fine. I feel like I'm going to get myself into some sort of trouble if I go any further than that, so we're done here. The only thing I'll add is that this shot is unnecessary. The Animal Friends received a slew of renders. Rambi has always been the flagship steed of the franchise, so he received the most attention. I think On Guard looks the best, though. The plasticky texture makes him look extra fishy. Espresso has the best name, but the least remarkable design, even with those classy shoes of his. Winky looks fine from all angles except the front. This shot is downright unsettling. Squawks also looks strange from this angle. The hints of eerie red lighting don't help matters. He looks fine from the side, at least. I love the shots of Diddy riding the Animal Friends. Look at how he's clinging onto them. He's so tiny. There are similar shots of DK riding the Animal Friends, but his larger size makes me wonder how any of them besides Rambi can even carry him around. Before we move on to the game's enemies, I would like to stress that this video is not a comprehensive overview of every single render produced for the original Donkey Kong Country trilogy. I'm only highlighting the renders that I find interesting and worthy of discussion. A lot of the series' simpler enemies can be summed up as snake, or shark, or dragonfly. So these sections will be heavily abridged for the sake of everyone's sanity. Back to the reviews. Zingers look terrifying in high resolution. I'll put up with wasps, but wasps with spikes? No, thank you. The queen is even worse somehow. I never thought a bug could look unimaginably, irreparably angry, but this one succeeds with its aggressive, off-kilter eyeballs and veiny abdomen. She wants me dead so badly that she might pop a blood vessel before she can finish the job. Neki received several renders, and rightfully so. The way the light catches its wings makes them look pretty, at least for a vulture. Manky Kong looks absolutely f***ing disgusting. I think these renders are some of the best because they do such a good job of portraying this abhorrent creature. The long and bony fingers, the sharp and uneven teeth, the tattered beard and fur, it all looks so terrible. Mario Wiki, citing
the enclosed instruction book,
says Manky Kong is a Kong reject orangutan. I can't exactly blame DK for wanting to keep his distance from this guy, but what does one have to do to become an official Kong exactly? Is it based on good hygiene? Blood relations? Shared political views? The social dynamics of DK Island warrant additional exploration. Naughty looks fine, if a bit zombified. I'm much more interested in its larger counterparts, Very Naughty and Really Naughty. The former looks a bit more lifelike, although its body looks like it's covered in green felt instead of fur. Really Naughty looks much more natural, but what the heck is wrong with its tail? It looks like a texture that you would find in a test level. As an aside, I love these guys' dumb names. I quite like DKC1's batch of Kremlings. Claptrap looks sufficiently off-putting with those massive teeth. His little hands creep me out as well. I appreciate the simplicity of Critter's design and like the shade of green used on his skin, although the little bits of armor on his shoulders and knees look like they came from the dollar store. Krusha, in contrast, looks like a high-quality action figure in most of his renders. Clump looks similar, but the more prominent scales on his body don't sell the illusion quite as effectively. At long last, we've reached the man, the myth, the legend himself, King K. Rool. What a magnificent character. His sheer girth coupled with his tiny legs give him a cartoonishly imposing silhouette. The rich colors of his cape, skin, and aurum attire lend some credence to his claims of royalty. The shot of him covering his snout with his hand perfectly encapsulates his personality. Everyone knows that he's a bastard, and he knows that everyone knows, but he still has the gall to act like he's offended by our accusations of malfeasance. I relish every second I get to spend hating this man. In short, the creation of King K. Rool was a massive success. Incredible work. Next, I want to discuss some scenes created to promote the game. First up is the render that appeared on the non-Japanese box art. DK and Diddy seem to be making a frantic getaway from the Kremling crew. It's such a shame that they're all fighting over a bunch of clearly artificial bananas. For that matter, all of the plants in this image, from the bananas to the trees to the ferns, look awfully waxy. The render that appeared on the Japanese box art is a bit stronger in my opinion, if only because it isn't as chaotic. The mountain in the background helps to give the world a bit more scale. This render has a poster variant that shuffled a few characters around and added a pair of CG peaks to the background. When I was in high school, I actually printed out a copy of this image and stuck it to the corkboard in my room. Yep, my unhealthy obsession stretches back that far. The wooden rendition of the logo completes the image, and I vastly prefer it to the sleek, gradient-heavy logo that appears in most other contexts. There are a few other renders of the Kongs just hanging around in the jungle. The ones that take place during sunset are incredibly atmospheric. I can practically feel the humidity and hear the crickets chirping from the underbrush. I would even put up with Cranky's ranting if I could just savor an evening like this for a while. The faint lights and stark shadows present in these renders make the caves seem sufficiently empty and dour. Diddy really needs to find somewhere else to put his hand in this render. He's killing DK's depth perception, which is a pretty important sense to have when you're navigating a minecart-based death trap. This render is absolutely beautiful, but I'm struggling to believe that DK and Diddy are actually underwater. The lack of a water filter in the foreground makes them look like they're just floating in midair or suspended from tiny, invisible strings. This render of Treetop Town depicts a rather strange scenario. DK is absolutely oblivious to the Kremling's presence, and Diddy looks like he's in no hurry to issue a warning or throw that barrel. At least the Kongs seem somewhat perturbed by the Necky's presence in this snowy scene. While we're here, let's take a quick gander at this tree. Is the snow all crumpled up and clipping through itself, or am I crazy? It just looks weird. I would rather not end this section on a sour note, though, so allow me to briefly praise the lighting. The soft pink color of the sky, combined with the long shadows, make for some nice early morning vibes. Rather than head straight into Donkey Kong Country's sequel, I want to have a brief conversation about its handheld prequel? What is Donkey Kong Land exactly? It isn't a sequel, and it certainly isn't a port. It doesn't matter. This game is the only one in the Game Boy trilogy to have a fair share of unique renders. The few handheld exclusive enemies look rough. Their models are much less complex than those of their SNES native brethren, and their textures are muddy and noisy. I assume these guys, much like most handheld variations of console games, were crafted on a strict budget. This pig looks like a cheap, metallic lawn ornament, and this poor fish looks like he's rusting. To the fish's credit, though, he never actually appeared in the game. An unused animal friend looks similarly gross. The only other renders of note belong to this mysterious Kong with a hat. Nobody knows what purpose he was supposed to serve, assuming he ever had a purpose at all. His stout stature and stylish headgear make him look like a pretty amusing character. I wouldn't mind seeing this bootlegger appear in the next Donkey Kong game, whenever that comes out. Alright, now we're ready to move on to Donkey Kong Country 2. The first game served as an excellent intro to the series' SNES-Era art style, so we won't need to take a very exhaustive look at the main Kongs this time around. The biggest difference from DKC-1's renders is that the fur received a complete overhaul. It still suffers from sleeve syndrome on occasion, but it has actual texture and fuzziness now. A year's worth of technological advancement worked wonders. DKC-2 also bestowed DK and Diddy with the yellow accents on their clothes. Furthermore, it bestowed the world with another lovable character in the form of Dixie Kong. With a strong design and an expressive face, she looks great all around. Her hair doesn't even look slightly realistic, but that isn't a bad thing. The shiny, reddish strands look super cool. My only real nitpick is that she, as a chimpanzee, should have 5 digits on each hand. So much for anatomical accuracy, I guess. DKC-2 leans much harder into the series' partnership mechanic than DKC-1 did. There are several shots of Diddy and Dixie charging forward or just hanging around. This one is my favorite. Their similar poses emphasize their effectiveness as a team, and I like how Diddy is looking at Dixie with a sense of admiration. Relationship goals. And this might just be me, but something about Diddy's face in this specific shot makes him look a bit older than usual. I like it, particularly in contrast to certain other characters who will appear shortly. Several other renders show Diddy and Dixie interacting with various logos and hardware. This render of the Kongs holding something overhead pulled double duty as both a generic promotional shot and the cover of the player's guide. Similarly, this render was created to promote Donkey Kong Land 2, but ended up returning for the Game Boy Advance port of DKC2. Hey, I'll never complain about an efficient reuse of assets. There are also a couple of shots of the Kongs hauling an SNES controller around, but I'm more interested in this awkward shot of Diddy by himself. Don't worry, buddy. I too know what it's like to pose for a picture and not know what to do with my hands. I have little to say about this game's supporting Kongs. Cranky looks a bit less boiled, and he traded his stick for a pair of actual canes. Wrinkly Kong looks like a perfectly pleasant grandmother, and the only interesting thing about her render is this recipe for worm pie? At least it admits that the idea is terrible. I'm more offended by its refusal to describe what groovy gravy is. That sounds delicious in isolation. Finally, Swanky Kong looks like a tryhard. Whereas Funky is naturally cool, even more so with his new single-shade sunglasses, Swanky is artificially cool, and I find that unacceptable. As far as the animal friends go, Squawks received a new render. Fur textures weren't the only thing that improved in the time between games, since his feathers are much more defined. Rattly Clapper and Glimmer all look pleasant enough, and Squitter looks like a psycho with those highly defined teeth. His 4 pristine pairs of DK-branded shoes don't make him seem any less fanatical. In terms of enemies, we have a pair of rodents that fall on opposite sides of the spectrum for me. Neek, with his gigantic nose and crossed eyes, is incredible. 11 out of 10 would have him perform at my birthday party. Spiny, meanwhile, is a total nightmare. Those quills look nasty enough on their own, but that look on his face makes me think he'll gladly use them for attack instead of defense like a normal porcupine. The Cat O'9tails, which could easily double as Sonic the Hedgehog's meth-addled cousin, is DKC2's equivalent of Manky Kong in terms of poor hygiene. The beady eyes, ratty fur, and long, yellowed nails strongly discourage me from turning my back on this thing. If I had been a kid when I found this render of Screech, I would have become unreasonably fond of him. Something about evil copies of existing characters really appealed to me, hence why I also loved characters like Dark Link and Shadow the Hedgehog. Even today, I think this design is neat. And I may be reading too much into it, but his wings kind of look like tree branches near the end of fall and really convey the idea of death and decay. The Kremlings are a mixed bag for me. Some are basic and inoffensive, some are dopey and charming, some piss me off, and some are downright intimidating. Let's take a closer look at Clubba and Cudgel. They're packing some nasty weapons, and their ludicrously top-heavy proportions make me want to stay as far away from them as possible. The darker palette on Cudgel really solidifies his design for me. In a similarly intimidating vein, the ghostly Kremlings look incredible with their glowing eyes and raggedy textures. Shoutouts to Cackle's bones in particular. They actually look rough and dirty, unlike the often plasticky skin of his fleshy brethren. I'd actually say Cackle is this section's MVP. With how he's baring those teeth, he seems to be enjoying himself. His beta design, otherwise known as Mr. X, is similarly creepy, but I can see why Rare wanted to try for better. His silhouette isn't nearly as distinct, and his uniformly dark colors make his entire body blur together into a single, dark lump. I don't have much to say about King K. Rool in this case. Everything that was strong about his design remains true, although that coat does look awfully classy. Before we move on, I want to draw attention to this render of the Kremlings as a collective. It kinda looks like it was posed in Gary's mod with how everyone is just kinda standing around in a cramped cluster. In terms of pre-rendered scenes, there are a ton that depict DKC2's first world, Gangplank Galleon. The ship's model has an impressive amount of detail, which you can see whenever there aren't a bunch of enemies cluttered in front of it. These two are the best by far. I'm getting some Indiana Jones vibes from how Diddy and Dixie are swinging around and wreaking havoc in enemy territory while hopelessly outnumbered. There is a lot going on in this render, which served as the non-Japanese version's box art. Notice how Screech is abusing Squawks near the top. DK looks livid in his cage over there, and On Guard seems shocked by the whole ordeal. I slightly prefer the version used by the Game Boy Advance port. The faint mist in the background makes me think of a chilly morning on the high seas, and that sounds so relaxing and liberating. Except for the squad of murderous reptiles that actually owns the ship anyway. The renders tied to the swampy levels are super atmospheric. While the colorful flora and fungi make this place seem like a forester's fantasy, the fauna make it a bit frightening. The shot of the cloaks looming in the background is highly unsettling. And I'm not sure why Diddy nor Dixie seems terribly concerned by the pair of crockheads in the water beside them, but someone is probably going to lose a limb. The shots of the bramble levels are also nice. They don't provide as much environmental context as the others, so we just have to accept that Diddy and Dixie are impossibly high in the sky and doing their best to navigate through this mess. This one might be phone wallpaper material. I love how the dark green vines contrast with the bright blue sky and wispy clouds, although the face on the balloon is kinda goofy. You know what? Never mind. There are some additional scenes that are only available in a low and, quite frankly, gross resolution. These are the only two worth mentioning. The one on the left is funny, if only due to the mischievous look on Diddy's face, and the zinger looming in the background makes the one on the right unreasonably terrifying. This shot of King K. Rool is surprisingly ominous. I know he's mostly a joke, but the low angle and faint green lighting make him look much more threatening than usual. This render contains yet another example of the characters existing in the same scene as some real-world logo. In a similar vein, there are these shots of treasure chests that contain the developers' logos. This image has cozy lighting, and this one features an appearance from a certain plumber. He looks like a nutcracker. Adorable, but I'm glad Nintendo themselves did much better in the N64 era. Finally, let's take a look at the renders produced for Donkey Kong Country 3. Dixie Kong looks exactly the same as before, so we can just skip over her. As for Kiddy Kong, I'm going to take a page out of John Cartwright's book and admit that I hate this child. In fact, these renders made me hate him. Watching him jump around in-game is one thing. The compression hides a lot of the worst details, but between his dopey face, overly detailed lips, and whacked-out proportions, I just can't stand him. There is nothing happening in this Kong's head. Nothing. And don't even get me started on his outfit. The attached socks don't even fit, they just flop around. And considering how much water is present in the Northern Hemisphere, those socks will get soggy and squishy and miserable within minutes. Absolutely vile. Alright, I think I've had my fill of bullying toddlers for the day. Let's talk about a Kong who's standing at death's door instead. Cranky looks exactly the same as he did in DKC 2, although he opted for a much more colorful sweater this time around. I gotta admit that I quite like Wrinkly Kong's hiking gear. It looks warm and functional. Can't complain about that. Funky Kong seems to be channeling a bit of Tim the Toolman Taylor at this stage in his life, for better or worse. And Swanky Kong received a complete redesign. I vastly prefer this version. The golden vest, tailored slacks, and shiny cane give him the decadence one might expect from a circus ringmaster. Much better than this fuzzball in a coat. We also have individual renders for all of the Brothers Bear. They're all charming in their own ways, I suppose, although the detailed fur and droopy circular eyes make some of them look like bad animatronics. Bazooka is my favorite due to the absurdity of the concept. The only two truly new animal friends introduced in DKC 3 are Ellie and Perry. Ellie is decently cute, although her model looks a bit lumpy. She looks better in an active pose. Perry, meanwhile, is solid all around. The warm, almost wooden color on his body complements his red and blue accents. He looks like he belongs on top of a totem pole. Quawks is unremarkable due to his status as a basic palette swap of Squawks. By the way, thanks, Doc. DKC 3's batch of enemies contains some decent designs and some unforgivable abominations. This chunky bird is incredible, and these literal clownfish look so endearingly stupid that I feel obligated to protect them at all costs. I'm not a fan of the Buzz enemies. Even though they have saws on their abdomens, they look significantly less threatening than Zingers, not to mention that their faces make them look like discount cereal mascots. Most of the bosses look sufficiently imposing, although I hate this urchin. It looks like its existence consists of nothing but unyielding pain. I also loathe Squirt on account of its Cy Snoodles-esque face. I can only think about one CG abomination at a time, thank you very much. Out of DKC 3's batch of Kremlings, the only ones I really like are Coin and Bazooka due to the bucket helmet and the ridiculously oversized cannon, respectively. These barrel guys are also fun, assuming they actually count as Kremlings. The rest look too generic. Whereas earlier Kremlings have some grit and an obvious mean streak, the later ones look too smooth and sanitized. I'm not sure whether the changes were conscious choices or simple byproducts of technological advancement. Either way, I wish Rare would have stuck with most of the older designs and put their resources elsewhere. Chaos gets points by virtue of not being a generic lizard. It looks about as good as anyone could expect from a robot crafted out of old pots and pans. I take slight issue with the lighting on its face. The bright sheen on one side and the dark shadows on the other somewhat obscure its menacing grin. It looks better in the game itself. The creator of Chaos, Baron K. Rulenstein, is unremarkable beyond his terrible new hairstyle. Let's move on to the pre-rendered scenes. The render that served as the game's box art is incredible. With the airboat, I mean hovercraft, crashing through the water and Dixie scanning the horizon with her ponytail flapping in the wind, it really sells the sense of adventure. The relatively detailed geography, huge stretch of blue sky, and pair of cabins help make the Northern Hemisphere feel like an actual place worth exploring. I would love to get a whiff of the pine trees and feel the cool mist splash onto my face. This render is creatively staged with how it depicts Dixie and Kitty leaping out of a cross-section of a tree. I strongly disagree with Dixie's casual reaction to the giant spider, though. Here we have a render of the duo exploring a factory. I think this image is a scan of a poster, given the weird desaturation and what I believe are signatures near the bottom. A wallpaper produced for the GBA port gives us a much clearer look at the scene. The sheer amount of detail in the background is impressive, and Crimp looks so much creepier than he did in his own renders. Very nice all around. I just really hope Kitty doesn't slip and fall into that vat of molten metal. That would be a tragedy. We also have two new, scanned shots of Dixie, both of which make her look a bit more artificial than usual. The render that served as Donkey Kong Land 3's box art evokes adventurous vibes, much like its SNES counterpart, plus Dixie and the stupid fish look utterly adorable. Here we have some more unremarkable, low-resolution renders. I do want to put a pin in this Christmas-themed one, though. It accurately captures the excitement and magic that I felt for the season before I became old and cynical. I'm not going to dive any further into this one at the moment, since I would rather save it for a theoretical Christmas special. See you all in 9 months, I guess. Or maybe sooner if I take forever to publish this thing. Finally, here's a render of the Kongs relaxing and playing on a Nintendo 64. The way in which the glow of the TV casts long shadows onto the wall and provides hints of assorted, homey clutter makes this visual particularly cozy. Although it's also pure propaganda for the console, seeing as the youngins find it jaw-droppingly amazing, and Cranky is even willing to touch the thing in the first place. They better enjoy this moment while it lasts, since the only N64-era Donkey Kong game is going to fire Dixie and Kitty and outright kill Wrinkly. And on that highly depressing note, I think this video has run its course. I did plan to cover Donkey Kong 64's renders at one point, but I thought it best to focus on one console at a time. Besides, this video ended up being much longer than I anticipated. It covered fewer games and somehow hit the same length as the last one. I'll probably release a video about N64-era Rareware renders in the distant future. Before I go, I would like to extend my sincerest thanks to everyone who researches, scans, and uploads these renders. They're the real masterminds behind these videos, even if I don't know any of them. I'm just some dude with a voice and way too many opinions about obscure gaming-related topics. And speaking of my voice, I really hope you noticed that I bought a new microphone. No longer will my voice sound like it's coming from inside one of these barrels. My apologies to the folks who struggled to hear me in the last video. I wanted to mask the static and background noise generated by my old mic, but I evidently went too far in a few places. If I had known that the video would receive 150,000 views, I would have bought this one much earlier and made a much better first impression. Oh well. Thanks to everyone who provided earnest, constructive feedback on that and other issues. I hope to perfect the formula sooner rather than later. In a broader sense, the likes and comments on the previous video gave me a ton of motivation to work on this one, so keep doing that if you want me to keep doing this. And if you want to see more videos that badly, you might as well subscribe while you're at it. Oh, and I'm sorry for the slight wait. I had a run-in with a certain virus and ended up bedridden for a week. I'm all good now, but I lost a good chunk of time. Thanks for watching this video now that it's finally out, and I'll see you around.